Trump just threatened military action against a NATO ally. Then he backed down. But EU leaders say there's no going back. Here's why January 22nd, 2026 might be the day Europe decided to break free from America. What you're about to hear isn't speculation. It's not political commentary. This is what's happening right now in Brussels as European Union leaders convene an emergency summit to fundamentally reassess their relationship with the United States. On January 22nd, Reuters reported that despite Donald Trump's abrupt U-turn on threatening tariffs and military action against Greenland, EU diplomats have made something clear. A line has been crossed. One EU diplomat put it bluntly. Trump crossed the Rubicon. He might do it again. There is no going back to what it was. Today, we're breaking down exactly what happened, why EU leaders are taking this unprecedented step, and what this means for the future of the transatlantic relationship. This isn't just about Greenland. This is about decades of defense arrangements, trillions in trade, and the entire architecture of Western cooperation that's existed since World War II. Let's get into it. To understand why this summit is happening, we need to be clear about the sequence of events. Donald Trump, recently inaugurated as president on January 20th, 2025, threatened tariffs on 8 European nations. But it didn't stop there. He also threatened military action to acquire Greenland, a semi-autonomous territory of Denmark, which is a NATO ally. Let that sink in for a moment. The President of the United States threatened military action against a territory belonging to a NATO member. This isn't a distant adversary. This is an ally within the very defense alliance that has been the cornerstone of Western security for over 70 years. Then, on Wednesday, January 21st, Trump abruptly reversed course. He stepped back from the tariff threats. He ruled out using force to take Greenland. He suggested a deal was in sight to end the dispute. Late on Wednesday, on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Trump reached a framework deal with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. According to Rutte's interview with Reuters on Thursday, this deal involves Western allies stepping up their presence in the Arctic, with ongoing talks to continue between Denmark, Greenland, and the United States on specific issues. But here's the critical point. Several EU diplomats noted there are still few details about this new plan. As one-third diplomat said, nothing much changed. We still need to see details of the Greenland deal. The damage is done. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz welcomed Trump's U-turn and urged Europeans not to be too quick to write off the transatlantic partnership. But the damage to confidence has already been done. EU governments remain wary of another change of mind by what they are now calling a mercurial president. They are focused on creating a longer-term plan for how to deal with the United States under this administration and possibly its successors too. The bully across the Atlantic. Here's what's remarkable about the diplomatic language being used. These aren't anonymous sources making inflammatory statements. These are official EU diplomats speaking on the record to Reuters, and they're using the word bully. One second EU diplomat stated, "We need to discuss where the red lines are, how we deal with this bully across the Atlantic, where our strengths are." A third diplomat said, "We are a bit fed up with all the bullying." This is not normal diplomatic language. This represents a fundamental shift in how European officials are talking about the United States. The unpredictability factor. The second diplomat raised the key concern that's driving this emergency summit. Trump says no tariffs today, but does that mean also no tariffs tomorrow? Or will he again quickly change his mind? We need to discuss what to do then. This isn't just about what Trump did. It's about the lack of predictability in US policy. When you can't rely on commitments made one day, holding the next day, you can't plan, you can't build strategy, you can't maintain partnerships. Why EU leaders can't just move on? One EU diplomat explained the strategic imperative. We need to try to keep him close while working on becoming more independent from the US. It is a process, probably a long one. This is the balancing act Europe now faces. They can't simply cut ties with the United States, but they also can't continue operating under the assumption that the relationship will function as it has for decades. Defense dependence. After decades of relying on the United States for defense within the NATO alliance, the EU faces a stark reality. They lack the needed intelligence capabilities, transport capabilities, missile defense systems, and production capabilities to defend themselves against a possible Russian attack. This isn't a minor gap. This is fundamental military infrastructure that takes years, if not decades, to build. And this dependence gives the United States substantial leverage over European policy. The question EU leaders are now asking is, can we continue to be dependent on a partner whose commitment we can no longer predict? Trade exposure. The United States is Europe's biggest trading partner. This makes the EU vulnerable to Trump's stated policies of imposing tariffs to reduce Washington's trade deficit in goods and, as demonstrated with Greenland, to achieve other geopolitical goals. Before Trump's reversal, the EU had been considering a package of retaliatory tariffs on 93 billion euros worth of US imports, equivalent to $108.74 billion. They were also considering anti-coercive measures. But here's the critical constraint. EU officials knew such steps would harm Europe's economy as well as the United States. This is the bind Europe finds itself in. They need leverage, but using that leverage comes at a significant cost. The strategic weakness. What the past week has exposed is that Europe's heavy reliance on the US in defense and trade has created strategic vulnerabilities. As one EU diplomat noted, the bloc needs to move away from this heavy reliance in many areas. This isn't about becoming hostile to the United States. This is about reducing structural dependencies that can be exploited. The Emergency Summit Agenda. Although Thursday's emergency EU talks in Brussels have lost some of their immediate urgency following Trump's reversal, the longer-term issue of how to handle the relationship with the US remains front and center. One fourth EU diplomat explained, the approach of a united front in solidarity with Denmark and Greenland, while focusing on de-escalation and finding an off-ramp has worked. At the same time, it would be good to reflect on the state of the relationship and how we want to shape this going forward, given the experiences of the past week and year. Building resilience. A third diplomat outlined the key priorities. We need to act on a few things. More resiliency, unity, get our things together on internal market, competitiveness, and no more accepting tariff bullying. Let's break down what this means in practical terms. More resiliency. Reducing dependencies on single partners, diversifying supply chains, building redundancies in critical systems. Unity. Maintaining a common European position rather than allowing the US to negotiate bilaterally with individual member states, which could divide the bloc. Internal market strengthening. Making the European economy more integrated and efficient so it's less vulnerable to external pressure. Competitiveness. Improving Europe's economic position so it has more leverage in any trade disputes. Rejecting tariff bullying. Establishing clear red lines and consequences for coercive trade practices. The red lines discussion. One second diplomat emphasized the need to establish boundaries. We need to discuss where the red lines are, how we deal with this bully across the Atlantic, where our strengths are. This is about defining what Europe will and won't accept. What actions would trigger a unified European response? What forms would that response take? These are the questions being answered in Brussels. The Arctic dimension. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stated that under the framework deal, Western allies would have to step up their presence in the Arctic. This reveals what the Greenland dispute was really about: strategic positioning in the Arctic, where climate change is opening new shipping routes and access to natural resources. The Arctic is becoming a critical geopolitical space, with Russia and China both increasing their presence. Trump's focus on Greenland, while appearing erratic, actually reflects real strategic concerns about Arctic access and influence. The precedent problem. Here's what makes this moment so significant. If a US president can threaten military action against a NATO ally and then simply reverse course, what does that say about the reliability of US commitments? This isn't just about Trump's personality or style. This is about the credibility of American security guarantees. If Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which states that an attack on one member is an attack on all, can be called into question by threats from within the alliance, the entire foundation of European security is shaken. What success looks like for Europe. The fourth diplomat statement about the united front in solidarity with Denmark and Greenland working suggests that European unity did achieve something. Trump backed down. The immediate crisis was diffused. But the fact that leaders are still convening to discuss the longer-term relationship shows they understand this isn't over. They secured a tactical win, but recognize they face a strategic challenge. The long game. One EU diplomat described the path forward. We need to try to keep him close while working on becoming more independent from the US. It is a process, probably a long one. This is the central tension Europe must navigate. They need to maintain the relationship with the United States while simultaneously reducing their vulnerability to US policy shifts. This is complex, expensive, and will take years to accomplish. What you need to know. Here's what matters from today's analysis. First, the EU-US relationship has fundamentally changed. Even though Trump reversed his threats, European leaders have made clear they cannot return to the previous status quo of unquestioning reliance on American partnership. Second, Europe faces structural vulnerabilities in both defense and trade that give the United States significant leverage. Addressing these vulnerabilities will require massive investment and political will sustained over many years. Third, the language EU diplomats are using, calling the US president a bully and saying Trump crossed the Rubicon, represents a historic shift in how European officials talk about America. Fourth, despite the framework deal on Greenland, details remain unclear, and EU leaders remain skeptical about the reliability of US commitments going forward. Fifth, the emergency summit in Brussels is focused on building European resilience, maintaining unity, strengthening the internal market, improving competitiveness, and establishing red lines against coercive behavior. What happens next? Watch for concrete proposals coming out of the Brussels summit on European defense spending, joint procurement programs, and trade policy coordination. These will signal how seriously Europe is taking this independence agenda. Pay attention to whether the details of the Greenland deal actually materialize and whether all parties interpret it the same way. The vagueness of the current framework could lead to future disputes. Monitor whether Trump maintains his reversal on tariffs or whether, as EU diplomats fear, he changes his mind again. The pattern of behavior matters more than any single decision. The bottom line. January 22nd, 2026 marks a turning point. Not because of what Trump did or didn't do, but because of how European leaders responded. They're no longer asking whether they need to reduce dependence on the United States. They're asking how to do it. The transatlantic relationship isn't ending, but it's being fundamentally redefined. And that redefinition will shape global politics for decades to come. That's the reality. That's what's happening right now. And that's what you need to understand about this moment.